think I always wanted to be a storyteller. And I never knew how that would manifest, but I always liked creating stories. I grew up loving movies and comic books and animation, and I always just had my ideas and I'd write them down, and I felt like I couldn't be happy unless I was in a situation where I could get my stories out. So when I got into animation, to a large degree, that was a format that I felt I could, be a storyteller in maybe a small way because I was working on other people's projects for studios, but I felt like what I was doing was intrinsic to telling a story within the context of somebody else's property. But even a background, when I would do a background design, the background needed to tell a story. It needed to have a point of view. It needed to psychologically express the story moment of that scene. And if there was a tone or an emotion in the story, the background needed to express that. And how could I do that through composition and perspective and lighting to tell a story? So I got my jollies out to an extent that way, but always underneath that, I had my own ideas. And it wasn't too long after being in Los Angeles that I just started putting together my own presentations. And I had ideas that it could be a movie, it could be a TV series, it could be a comic book series. So I did what most people do in Los Angeles is I just started pitching ideas, getting an agent, pushing ideas to comic book companies. But all along, I'm working for the studios is my livelihood. But whenever I had a chance, I would start working on my own ideas, and then that's just been a nonstop process ever since of juggling things all the time, or keeping the plates spinning on the pole like in the old Ed Sullivan show. But I like to get a lot of plates spinning and try to keep the momentum of all the plates going simultaneously. And if I'm on a big job, then that slows down. But then as soon as I have a break, then I have to try to get the momentum back up again on the other projects. I would have to say Ray Harryhausen was the light bulb for me. And interestingly enough, I have this conversation fairly often, how influential Ray Harryhausen was for a whole generation of storytellers and filmmakers. But I think, and maybe to an earlier degree too, King Kong was a movie that just sort of overwhelmed me. But then I think when The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad came out, and I was 6 or 7 at the time, but I think you could feel it in the audience at the movie house, that when the Cyclops emerged out of the cave, and it was the first time anybody had seen anything fantastic in this movie, it was like a jolt of electricity that went through the crowd. I mean, nobody had seen anything like this kind of animation before, and we didn't even really know it was animation. It just looked real because of the three-dimensional quality of the puppetry. And so the illusion of it was perfect. You look at it now and you see all the flaws in it, but at the time it was state of the art. And in the credits of the movie it said dynamation. That was the term they used for this style of animation, and we're all going, dynamation, what is that, dynamation? But the movie was just overwhelming, and in a lot of ways, beat by beat, it's sort of the perfect movie. And I remember since you never knew if you'd ever be able to see that movie again. Maybe it would appear years later on late night television or something, but to keep it alive, and a lot of my friends back then did this too, we memorized it, and then we just kept it turning over and over again, moment by moment in our heads, knowing it scene by scene, and just keeping it fresh. And so I think that, and then later Jason and the Argonauts came out, and that was to a lesser degree influential. But I think that's when the form of movie making, storytelling started to get a trigger for me of something that was magical and wonderful, and you could experience it to a larger degree back then too in comic books. It's a long aha moment I'm describing, but reading Marvel comic books, and to an earlier degree before that DC Comics, but when Jack Kirby started creating the whole Marvel mythology with Stan Lee, I was sort of there at the beginning, and you were watching an embryonic creation grow into an enormous mythology of complexity, and you were just sort of taken along on this magic ride of heroes and villains and gods and goddesses, and it kept going in new places that nobody had seen before back then. So I think that was profound for me, and that also instilled a love of backgrounds and place, because Jack Kirby was so masterful at not only storytelling and designing great characters and describing action, but the world it took place in was very evolved and magical, and so the sense of place I think really excited me back then. Well, you could suspend disbelief, and I think to a large degree you have to keep that ability alive in you through your whole life. I think it gets harder as you get older to fall into a story and not have your logical brain sort of talking to you during it. But I think it's pretty essential to be able to lose yourself when you're seeing a movie or reading a story, and fall into it and suspend disbelief and be inside of it, experiencing it, rather than being outside observing it. Right now I'm working on a secret project, but the concept is so insane, and everybody knows it's crazy, and yet this is what we have to do, and it's got to be believable and logical, but it's impossible. This can't happen, but yet we have to make it work. And you're just fighting all the time with your logical brain, going, "There's no way. There's no way. This can't happen." And actually, that happens a lot on assignments where you're asked to do something that doesn't exist. It's just fantastic. It's fantasy or science or super science fiction. But you have to create something from nothing and make it real. The first show I worked on was Rickety Rocket, Fang Face, Plastic Man, and I can't remember. There's one other one, but it was Ruby Spears was growing into a real studio after their first. They did one season of something, then suddenly they went from a small boutique shop to a big studio with 4 network series, and so I was kind of getting in on the ground floor of that, because they just needed warm bodies to hold pencils, and they were advertising. They were just desperate to find people to sit at the tables and produce these shows. But looking back, they were pretty pretty amusing. I mean, pretty silly, but at the time, that's what the entertainment was. There's definitely a leap in quality and intention going from TV mass production sort of assembly line animation, but you still, I mean, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but it's, the pressures are much different, and suddenly in theatrical you can spend the time to do very serious, I mean, you always are trying to be a serious artist, making everything artistically great. But then when you go to theatrical, you really have the time and the tools suddenly to take it on up to a much larger scale than you could before, and so the sense of responsibility and pressure is much greater. But then, the opportunity is so exciting to have that chance to do something much more serious and informative. So, and then of course, going into Disney at that time, just walking into the building, there was nobody else but Disney. I think Don Bluth might have broken away at that point and was maybe working on Secret and M at that time. So maybe there were two studios, but I mean, if you wanted to work in the movies, Disney was the only place, and everybody was trying to get in, and so when you finally got your foot in the door, you felt like you had arrived. You were, walking down the hollowed halls of Olympus or something, and you were suddenly becoming aware of a new realm of possibilities, technically in storytelling. I remember being shown the computer system, and it was like in a room with gigantic machines in it that were the computers. But they're essentially scanning everything into digital form, and then compositing the layers digitally instead of the lockdown camera and the multi-plane. I mean, backgrounds were still hand painted, the artwork was still hand drawn in animation, but then it was scanned for the first time digitally and then assembled in the computer. And one of the exciting things from a background point of view was you could do very complicated zoom-ins and pannings and camera movements, because once it's digital, you could have so many layers, and you could zoom in at different. You can make each layer zoom at different speeds and pan at different speeds in ways that you couldn't with the multiplane camera, which only had X number of layers maximum. And you were just at the dawn of something big and you didn't have any idea where it was going to go. But it was pretty exciting. I mean, just the fact that the artwork was being scanned and being composited digitally was, and that the final product was not. I could be getting ahead of it. I'm trying to remember if the final project was a digital. Was it digitally printed on? Anyway, I don't remember. But anyway, it was brand spanking new at the time. Yeah, actually, I'd moved out of Los Angeles at that point. I always wanted to be back in Portland, and I was very lucky to have been able to negotiate a sort of freelancer status at Disney, which was very unusual at that time. They always insisted that everybody work in-house and be an employee. And even back then, I had created my own business, and I was freelancing on Saturday morning. And it was my goal to create and develop my own story ideas and get that going. So I didn't want to be an employee in-house, because then I couldn't keep those other plates spinning. And I was very fortunate that Disney was very compromising with me, and I think I went into house 2 days a week, and then I could work the rest of the time from my studio down in Marina del Rey. And so that set up my status as a freelancer on feature films. And then when I moved back to Portland, I could keep going as a freelancer on other films because the precedent had been set. And at that point, I was starting to do some comic books too. So I definitely wanted to have the freedom to keep those things going while I was working on features and pitch ideas and things like that. So it was great when I was living in Portland out in the woods, basically, and I get a call long distance to work on Lion King and, ship things Federal Express and use a fax machine, which was, really pretty technically amazing for a freelancer in terms of how it helped you communicate with your studio people, because for the first time they could go, well, show me what you got, fax me over what your sketches are, and then we can work with you right away on what changes need to be done. So it helped up the game for freelancers quite a bit. Well, I always looked at it as having free time was the most important time for me, because I always wanted to further my own ideas along. So as soon as a project would end, of course I always worried about how I was going to pay my bills and sweating bullets. But then it was an opportunity to jump back into those other spinning plates. So I relished the opportunity to have time to keep throwing myself into making other things happen. And at that point, comic books were more and more happening. And I always felt like the balance of comics and animation was pretty good, because in animation, the pay is much better, and it's very artistic, but you don't necessarily ever get your work seen because it's collaborative by nature. So what you do is part of the process of helping people find what they want, whether or not they ever use anything you've ever done. And so some movies, you may not see anything of your work in the final product, but your work was important in helping them find what they did want. So you didn't have that satisfaction of an artist getting his work seen. So, if people go, well, I'm going to go see that movie, what shots are yours? And I'd say, well, actually, probably none of them, or maybe this one building I designed or something, but somebody else painted it, so it's not exactly mine. But in comic books, you labor mightily for a little pay, but your work is exactly 100% what's on the page. It was all about me getting my work seen. The ego was much more self-centered about working in the studio system. And I think it was one of the Disney movies I did a huge amount of work on. And they were saying, oh, we're following your backgrounds, and oh, wait, when you see this movie, you're going to see your work on the screen. And I remember going into some meetings, and they're explaining how they were using all my ideas. And then I went to see the movie when it came out, and I'm watching it, and there's nothing. And I felt this like knot in my stomach. I just twisting tighter and tighter through the movie, because I wanted to see my work on the screen, and I didn't. And after that moment, I realized I had to change my perspective about the process. I had to take my ego out of one pocket and put it in another pocket, and I had to look at it as more collaborative than individualistic. Well, on a lot of movies, I'll work, because I work at the very beginning of it before really the final script has been written or the movie's been storyboarded. They're looking for ideas to help develop the story, and maybe a year down the road, the story completely is rewritten, and everything you were working on is thrown out. It happens all the time. A lot of times, halfway through production, they shut it down and they retool it and they start over again. They hire and fire and rewrite. And I think that happened on Beauty and the Beast. Was one of the first times I heard about such a slaughter or the night of the long swords or something, or just heads rolled. So that happens still to this day. And so you just have to be happy with your part of the process. Well, I take a lot of photos, like if I go on hikes and even around, I live in sort of the woods, and a lot of trees and a lot of magical moments. And actually, one of those plates that I try to keep spinning all the time is to do, about maybe 10 years ago, I started feeling like I needed to do personal artwork. Not artwork for a film or for TV, for some form of entertainment, but just do exactly only what I want to do as maybe like a, quote, fine artist. So I started to realize that the world I live in the Northwest, is a very unique place geographically for nature. And just like there's the Southwest art that capitalizes on that unique landscape, I wanted to do something that uses the vocabulary of the Northwest. So I just call my work Northwest landscape art, but it incorporates the ideas of the world all around me. Whether I step out the door and the mist is rolling through the trees, or I go on a hike and there's the ferns and the waterfalls. But I've been trying to have that satisfaction of just only doing exactly what I want to do and hoping that somebody likes it. But it's a constant source of inspiration to just pay attention to the world of nature and then try to distill it into a vocabulary of ideas and icons that can become landscape art. It's interesting to try to be organized enough to create the filing system to take your photographs and things even in magazines. And I used to spend an enormous amount of time cataloging things for future reference, because you never know what you might need on some future project. And back when I was getting started more, I just would buy books insanely. Like, oh, here's a book on locomotives. And oh, here's a book on military costumes. And you just never know. Maybe I'll need this truck someday. And so I just have hundreds and hundreds of books and clippings. Today with Google, it's amazing how lazy I get of just, Googling some keywords to find some reference that I need. But, that special image, whether it's dog-eared in a book or in a clipping, or sometimes just only one special image creates the whole concept for you. And so any image is vitally important to keep track of in that respect, because it could be the difference between making or breaking a project. Just that one idea that magically speaks to you to give you the key to what the big IT what is the idea that drives the process for this one style that you're in pursuit of, or whatever the problem is you're trying to solve. Sometimes it just comes from even a part of an image or something. Yeah. Well, I always feel like the greatest success I can have as a freelancer is to get to do what I want to do, but make the client deliriously happy and give them what they want. Because ultimately, our job is to solve their problems. And you always have to start from step one of understanding what it is they need. you know, really getting the sense of the story issues and you know, I mean, it can be anything that they're calling you to do for them, but um, really researching and trying to get into their head, like what is it they want? What are they thinking? You know, and it's not at all at that part of the beginning of anything that you want to do. You have to first really be in their shoes. And then once you kind of think, oh, I know what they want now. Okay, now then you can start to feed in your experiences and your ideas and things you love if they're applicable to the problem. Sometimes you get part the way through it and you just go, okay, I can't, I have to scrap this. I shouldn't even show it to him because I realize I've gotten off the track. But you often do have that. Well, you can often solve their problem, but still make yourself really happy because maybe their problem is an intellectual idea that has to be solved, but stylistically, you can solve it in any number of ways. And the way you choose is a way that speaks to you more passionately or personally than some other choices you could make. I always feel like I have the freedom to make suggestions, not put a lot of time into it because they want my time to be spent solving their problems. But a lot of times I feel like I've got a better idea. And so I'll just throw it out. And sometimes it gets incorporated. Most of the time it doesn't. But I feel like when they call me up and want me on a project, it's also not just that they want my pencil on my paper, but they want my thinking as part of the process. And so there's no harm in going, okay, I'm working on that idea, but have you considered maybe what if da 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 da, and maybe sketch it out real quickly, shoot it at them, and then get back to what you're really supposed to be doing. But sometimes they really appreciate it, that it could, you know, trigger a new idea, a new thinking, because they're searching too. Some directors or art directors, they know exactly what they want, and you know they know exactly what you want, and that's just exactly what you're going to do, and you're not going to get sidetracked. But other times it's a much more exploratory process, and it's more open, and so you can, you know, go that direction. It's hard. There's no denying that. Ego is what drives us to choose our career paths, and you hopefully have a great passion for what you want to do, and that's passion is why you're there, and that's your passion is why they call you up. So, but you know, you must never lose the sight that you're working for them. And if you want to have a career at it, you need to give them what they want, and hopefully it's maybe what you want. But you have to be a team player. You maybe have to lose a job or hurt yourself career-wise for a while because you weren't able to manage your ego, and hopefully that doesn't happen to you. But you have to step outside of yourself and really wear the skin of the person you're working for, whether it's a producer, director, art director. You have to have passion or compassion for them and their enormous job. They you know, to make a movie is so difficult, and they're freaking out all the time. They have so many pressures, and they're working hours, you know, usually twice of what you're putting in, and they're going to be on it for years to see it through, and they're really coming to you because they want the artist to help them make their movie successful. They're not coming to you. I mean, every now and then somebody just goes, "Oh, we love what you do. Just do your thing," and that's wonderful. And sometimes that does happen where they just go, "Oh, do one of your cities or one of your landscapes or do something in outer space. Just have fun." But more often it's that I have this problem. I've got this incredibly difficult job. I need your help to help me. And so if you ever lose sight of that, then you're in the wrong business or you're in the wrong part of the business. Be aware that the film has hundreds of people working on it, and you're just one person, and it's the total sum of everybody's efforts that you see on the screen at the end, and it's all about collaboration.